Hi, Julie Asher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. It's almost Valentine's Day, and I've got a great three-dimensional Valentine's heart project for you. It's three-dimensional insofar as it's got lots of relief and texture, but it's not fully constructed like some of my boxes and bottles and things like that. So if you're just easing yourself into 3D, this is a good project for you because it doesn't require quite as much construction. I've sized this particular heart to be about 7.5 inches, which fits the top of my heart-shaped boxes, which I do in another video. But feel free to scale this down if you want to do something faster, or up if you want to do something humongous. Basically, what we're headed towards is this sort of vintage style heart, which involves a lot of different techniques. Rubber stamped fondant appliques form this lacy border, pipe detail along the edges, wafer paper, bows, stamped cookie on the center, and then all these flowers around here are all embossed cookie dough, not iced, just tinted dough, embossed and baked in silicone molds. And I've got a whole nother video that's going to talk about how to do that. This project involves one big cookie, the big 7.5 inch heart, like so, that we'll start with. Two smaller hearts that are going to form this arrow that goes through it. That's optional. One 2 to 3 inch heart that'll form the centerpiece that'll get sandwiched on top, and then anywhere from 13 to 15 other embossed cookies. So you could give this as one big special gift to someone you really love. Another way to present this is to not really stick anything down the way I have here and the way I will in this video, but just to arrange it on top of the big cookie, all these little decorative elements. And then this becomes almost a cookie platter. You know, people could come by and pluck off a flower and just have that until the whole thing's gone. So there are different ways to present it and use it. We are going to stick all the pieces down so it could be given as one big gift. So you want to start with an iced, completely dry cookie. And again, this is, I'll have all the dimensions and things in the video description and also on my website. And the first step is to get this border down. You want that kind of dry before you start putting other things around it. And I started that process of fondant applique here. And I'm going to continue with it along the other edge. I've got fondant rolled out already to the number 3 setting on my pasta machine. You could use a pin, but I find that I get a nice, really uniform thin roll with my pasta machine. And I've got a self-adhesive type stamp. This is one big unit. It's a lacy pattern, and it mounts itself to these acrylic blocks, which is kind of nice because you can see through it and position it much more easily than you can a wood-mounted stamp. The other thing to notice is I'm not going to be using this stamp just as it appears. I'm going to be cutting it up into smaller pieces and piecing it together. And so I encourage you to get creative with stamps. Don't take things necessarily so literally as they might first appear to you, because there are other ways to use things. I'm going to start by stamping them out, and I've just inked this pad. It was an uninked pad that had seen nothing before I applied food coloring to it. And this is my red liquid gel food coloring. I just inked it before we started the video, so hopefully there's still enough on there. If there's not, we'll re-ink it. But I've got a whole nother video on rubber stamping which shows how I use these pads. And I'm just going to press it here lightly into the fondant, lift it up. I'm going to do a couple more of those. Just one more. I don't really need to re-ink this pad between every single stamp. I can usually get away with 3 or 4 presses before I need to re-ink it. It's a foam pad, so it holds the food coloring a lot longer than a felt pad, which a felt pad does not, and I would probably have to re-ink it each time. I did then break these down into smaller units. Cutting, this is about an inch, 7/8 of an inch round cutter from my Atico cutter set. I'm just cutting this down so I end up with more of a scallopy border. I'm looking to make sure I've got the lacy piece centered in the cutter before I cut. And I need about 12 of these to go up each side. So I think if I cut out 4, I've already got 3 or 4 cut out over here. I should have plenty. I need 4 halves. And then from here I cut them in half in a particular way so that I have 2 little loops at the top of each half. And as with any fondant applique, which is what this is, thin fondant applique work, I stick it down with corn syrup as opposed to thick royal icing glue because it's less likely to become lumpy, you know, with the icing underneath it. I want to be a little careful about handling the stamp part if you just stamped them because it can smudge. I also let the fondant kind of partially dry, maybe for a few minutes before I stick them on so they're less stretchy when I try to put them down on the cookie. But I'm just gently tacking them down with a little bit of, all the way to the edge, you can see. We're going to come back in with a little dotted border in a second. And I'll be wiping my hands a lot in between applications to get corn syrup off of them so I don't get corn syrup on top of the cookie when I press these down. I'm just going to continue like so all the way up the side. Okay, I'm ready to put the last piece down, and you want to make sure that it's symmetric with the other side. And if it's not, I have a little extra space here. Now's the time to move any other pieces over. I'm going to slide this guy over a little bit before the corn syrup dries in place. And it's also best not to paint over the cookie as I was doing, because you can dribble corn syrup on it, but rather to have the corn syrup and painting all happening on a side of the cookie so you're not carrying it over the top of it. It might seem intuitive, but I've made that mistake before. And I'm going to have to rotate the cookie towards me to make sure that it's nice and symmetrically applied as viewed from the front. Okay, and then I just want to come down, pat any fondant appliques down that might be sitting out from the edge. You can use your finger or a paring knife. And I'm going to come back in and, just as a frame of reference, add some tiny little red dot work along the edge of the scallops and also this white border down at the bottom. And again, for that, any dot work, I use icing of beadwork consistency. You'll find those consistency adjustments on my website. I'm going to start first with a white. No particular reason. You could do this in any order. So beadwork consistency icing is relatively loose, forms a nice round bead on its own without a peak. I'll just control the size of the dot by how hard I pipe. I want pretty big ones, so I'm going to pipe a little bit longer than I will for the red ones, trying to match the size that I've already piped on the other side. I just think this adds kind of a frilly element to the edge of the cookie. On this dark gingerbread, it looks nice. The dots will spread a little bit more when they hit the cookies, so it's often wise to practice. Get the right flow and pressure on your work surface before you start in on a cookie to make sure you've got the size you want. You can decorate these any which way. And again, I'm going to remind you not to take this particular design as gospel. You know, there's so many different ways you could work with embossed cookies and transfers and appliques on top of these hearts to make a really beautiful cookie. And I'm going to show you a very different look achieved with just brown, mostly brown gingerbread, brown and pink, as opposed to the red and white scheme that I've got going here. I'll show you that at the very end and you'll see what I mean. There's a lot of design versatility. So it's most important to know the techniques. Then you can extrapolate and begin to design freely on your own. Now I'm going to turn to the red dots. And those I want to be much more dainty, as you can see from the one that I showed you earlier. You'll see I'm working on cardboard so I don't have to handle the cookie by the edge. And that's always a good idea because it's easy to mess up these borders. Let me get the big ones down first so they're all the same size. It's probably a smart thing to do. I find it's easier to kind of do all of one same size first and then come back and do the other side rather than kind of breaking the flow as you pipe all the way around. I like the dots here because it kind of closes off the gaps between the scallops, makes it look a little more continuous, the border. You could do any other kind of edging here. You could do a piped little scalloped zigzag edging. But we've got a lot of action going on with the cookies, the embossed flowers that are going to go in the center. So I'm trying to keep the border patterns somewhat simple, believe it or not. Now the tiny dots, I'm hardly pressing. Same opening, I'm just pressing with a different amount of pressure to get a very different sized dot. You could also pipe right down on the cookie itself. I've just chosen not to because if I make a mistake with the red on the light pink, it's harder to correct than it would be to correct up here next to dark red. And also, again, I'm going to have a lot of stuff coming close to the border, so I think the dots are going to show better a little higher up on the fondant itself. We've got the fondant border all done, and I've got all the dot work down. Now it's advisable to let those dots dry before I start loading all the other stuff on top because it'll be easy to nick those and smudge them. So I'm going to go ahead and set that aside and work on the center stamped cookie. Basically, what I'm doing is creating this little bird that's going to go sit on the top. I've already done one, and we'll probably end up using that one, but I just wanted to show you how I stamp, just a quick reminder of that. When stamping cookies, I like to do it on a non-skid surface. It just ensures less likelihood of moving this cookie and then moving the stamp and smudging the imprint. And I didn't ink the pad before. I think I do need to re-ink it now because it's been a while since I used it. So I'm just putting a little food coloring down on it. I don't want to leave it pooled like that, or I'll most certainly get too much on the pad itself. So I'm going to splot it uniform. And I've put my self-adhesive bird on here. He's a little bigger than the cookie, so he's going to fall off the edges a little bit, but that's okay. We're just going to ink it. With these big stamps, it's sometimes easier to ink this way, so it's up to you. This way you can see. And I am going to wipe off a little bit that I see on the edge that might create a shadow on the cookie. And now I want to try to get his tail up in that zone. So I think that'll be pretty good there. Placing it down, pressing, 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 pressing harder than you might think. The underlying icing is completely dry. That's the thing that's most important here, because otherwise you'll smush the icing. And I'm pushing all over the top, trying not to move the stamp, then lifting up. And I've got a nice imprint. I had a little heavier application of coloring here, this was actually the same exact food coloring, just a little more heavily applied to the ink pad, which is why it appears darker once printed. And the only difference between these two is I have a little red dotted border around this one that's already dry, so I'm going to go ahead and work with this cookie because I'll be able to speed the assembly process up further. But that's the basics of stamping on a cookie. It's a lot easier to stamp on fondant than it is on a cookie. So best to start with these fondant applique pieces first before advancing to cookie. And I've got a whole nother video on stamping on cookies, so we should have a pretty good idea of that. Should help you out if I didn't show you enough in this video. Okay, at this point, I'm going to start just sort of arranging what I want to go on the cookie before I stick anything down. And this is going to go in the center, as I said, and I've got a whole bunch of embossed flower pieces of various colors. And I achieve the different colors just by tinting the dough with different types of food coloring. Red, some pink with white food coloring, and then pressing the dough into molds like this, silicone molds, and baking within the mold. My other video on embossing cookies will talk about the benefits of in mold versus out of mold baking, why you might do one versus the other, but in general I prefer to bake in the molds when I can because I can get really crisp, fine results without the cookie spreading. Case in point, this beautiful red dahlia. It's like, just didn't spread at all because I baked it in the mold. Normally I might arrange it all, get a visual of how it would look, and then glue things down. But I think I'm just going to go ahead and start straight away on sticking them down because I think I have more likelihood of messing up that border if I'm in and out of the cookie too much because it's not quite dry. So to stick down, again, this is a sandwiching technique using thick royal icing glue. Nothing more than that, and pressing lightly. Just want to make sure that whatever you're gluing makes contact with the cookies somewhere. If it's leaning up against the cookies, sometimes you need to get the glue on the outer edge. I want a little dimension here, so I'm going to do a little bit of stacking of flowers as well. The only thing I want to be wary of is my placement of my arrow. Where is that going to be? And I want to avoid that area so that I have place to put my straw. And so the arrow is nothing more than a straw with cookies stuck at the ends. And I like to, let's see, I'm just looking at where I positioned the other one, which looks pretty good. I had it about yonder, and I had the other one up here coming off the other end. I cut them a little bit shy, you'll see. I'm just positioning these shy of the fondant so that the cookie can rest on the fondant and meet the straw. So I think that'll end up being glued about there. So the straw needs to be about 1/4 of an inch needs to come off that straw. I think that should be plenty. And then this one will sit right about there. You can also elevate the straw a little bit with a little bit of fondant, which I think I am going to do just so it meets the cookie a little bit better. It's more of the same height as the cookie will be when they're glued together. Like that look a little bit better. So now with those arrows placed and straight, we're going to let them dry a little bit in place before we put the hearts on. I'm just going to arrange the rest of the flowers around here, filling in kind of alternating colors. And where there are big gaps, we'll come in with some smaller beads and little royal icing roses and kind of fill those in. So some of these broken flowers actually work pretty nicely because they can nestle up against the straw or the edge of the heart and look kind of cute. Here's a different type I haven't used yet, but I think it needs a little lift underneath it, so I'll put maybe this one there. And again, you don't have to glue as you go as I'm doing. You could arrange them all first, make sure you've got them where you want them, and then start sticking things down. And that's more often what I do. Now this big cookie leaning, I think, looks a little weird because I want it to view really nicely from the top. So I will stick a little fondant under that to give it a little more height so it doesn't lean so much. So you're sticking the blob of fondant down, then I'm going to stick a little icing on top of it so the cookie actually sticks to it. Okay, I still haven't finished my flowers completely, but I want to anchor my hearts. They're going to extend off the cookie. So I've just placed a little bit of glue right at this connection point. It will flop off, so unless I support it underneath. So I've got a little piece of paper towel under there until it dries. And I'm going to do the same on this end over here. This might not need as much propping because it's smaller and it doesn't hang off the end as much. There's a little gap there which I might fill in with a bead of some sort towards the end of the process. One thing I didn't put on this one that I have put on others, let's see if there's room for it, are these little wafer paper bows. I think they could tuck nicely somewhere in up here. So let's see if we can insert those. And once I get them in, I'll give you a little bit of a sideline on how I made them. I think I like it up here because it kind of connects with the arrow. It's almost got the same, this ribbon wafer paper almost has the same pattern as the arrow itself, the straw that I use. So it kind of makes a visual connection. So I think I'm going to stick it up here. I'm just anchoring the bottom with a little bit of icing. I removed that rose, and that rose might just fit nicely down here with one or two more flowers. These embossed flowers tend to shed a little bit of crumb, so this is why I have my brush around, just to sweep that off. As I said, I was going to give you a little sideline on how I made that bow that went on my heart cookie, and it's a wafer paper bow. I've got another video on how to make wafer paper flowers and ribbons. I may not have covered this particular bow quite well on there, so I'm going to do it here. Basically, wafer paper comes pre-printed or not pre-printed. This is pre-printed with a pink gingham pattern, and that's what I used. Then I used my paper cutter to cut it into slightly less than 1/4 inch thin strips because I want a really delicate, nice looking bow. Wafer paper is kind of brittle and it can snap and crack, particularly if it's cold. To help give it a little bend, you can moisten the whole thing with water, but you want to be careful with that. Typically for this bow, I just moisten the ends with water so that they can cling to one another, and I kind of kind of fold them back onto each other like so. And out of a strip that's maybe 8 inches long, I might get 2 or 3 loops, depending on how big I make those loops. So I'll tend to make the little loop clusters, if you will, of 2 or 3 loops. Here's another one. Oops, I ripped that one, not good. Let's do another one. And then I'll group the clusters together to form a bigger bow. You could put them all together, but I find I have a little bit more freedom in terms of where I place them on the heart or any other cookie if I do them in smaller clusters. So here's a nice little unit of 3. If I wanted to attach it to that one, I just take a little bit more water and stick them together like so. These pieces are a little too big relative to those, so make sure you choose clusters that are scaled to one another when you put them together on your cookie. But that's basically it. Set it aside to dry and then place it on your cookie. I think I've got all the big flowers. Again, I tend to work bigger to smaller. So I got the big central heart down, then the biggest flowers down. And now I'm going to fill in nooks and crannies with smaller elements. I've got 3D royal icing transfers, these little mini roses, which I'll talk about how to make in a subsequent video, and also just some standard sugar dragées. These are about 4 to 5 millimeters, so they're bigger than the usual size. But they make nice little filler pieces. So for instance, I want this to form more of a point at the bottom. And I think a perfect way to do that is to stick one of these little hearts down, one of these little roses down here. These roses tend to have kind of big tails, so sometimes I'll take my scissors and just pare off the tails so they sit a little flatter to the cookie. You can also do that on a grater. Stick one more pink flower, I think, up here, but let me see what it looks like. Well, it covers that one too much. I think I'll tuck it in underneath the bow a little bit. I think everything's glued down. I might need a little more glue there. And then a few little red beads. I think these look as nice as centers in these bigger flowers. No rhyme or reason for where these are going necessarily. And also fill in this zone with a bead. One thing I do want to do is close off the blunt ends of this straw here. I just don't like seeing that cut end. You could also pipe some red dots there, which is what I think I did on the other one. I guess I don't mind it so much at that end, so I'm going to leave it. When I piped these heart pieces before, they were outlined and flooded, and at the intersection points like here, 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 and here, they don't look as neat as I would like. So I'm just going to pipe a nice big dot there to conceal that intersection. Looks pretty nice up here, and then tiny white ones there, there, and there. And I think that completes this particular red and pink Valentine look, using a lot of different textures achieved through different types of appliques, both fondant, stamped fondant appliques, royal icing transfers, and then embossed cookies. I would now set this aside to dry before I would attempt to move it onto a plate, because some of those pieces are still, particularly the arrow pieces, are still needing some drying time. We're going to put it over there. And before I break, I want to show you, as I said, a different style achieved through all the same basic methods, but some different shapes were used and some different colors were used, and you can get a different looking effect. I like this one. I think it's even more vintage looking because it's so antiqued. So for instance here, I really didn't tint much of the dough. This was just naked gingerbread, which I then sprayed or sponged with gold luster. In this case, where the flower is completely gold, it was sprayed. In this case, where the center heart just has the relief in gold, it was sponged with gold luster just to get those high points. Same thing with the top and bottom of the arrow. So again, use your creativity, understand the basic techniques, that's the most important thing, and then start applying them to create your own unique designs. Till next video, live sweetly.